So, we're doing what I called exercise 4A. Well, this is the Word document, but I'll show you the D12. Adding clearance for exhaust data. So when I say exhaust data, there's something called a converter. It's a file that you're going to download if you haven't done it already. And we're going to borrow some information that the geometry for the converter has been designed in the absolute position that it's supposed to be in, as far as the floor pan assembly. So we're going to temporarily add it to our assembly that we've been working on, and it'll show up in the correct spot where it's supposed to be installed relative to the floor pan. So, we got the Word document, we got that file. The main point of this part of our exercise is to show you we've got the floor pan all done. I have the cross members hidden. I'm in the assembly here, but I got the cross members all hidden. But we're trying to show you that sometimes after you get a part finished, or you think it's finished, or you got major parts of it finished, things change on you, and you find out the specifications changed or something changed, and you got to go back and incorporate a change that, well, if you would have known it at the time, you would have built it right in the first place. But it happens all the time, right? So in this case, there's a converter, like a catalytic converter, and it's sitting under the part over here, kind of towards the front like this. And there's requirements that it can only be a certain distance because of the heat and everything. It can only be a certain distance from the metal of the floor pan. And where they tell us this converter is, it's too close to the floor pan. So we have to make a little clearance area. It could be done a few different ways. The way we do it is to kind of put a little bump in the floor pan right here. And underneath that bump is where that converter is, and making it rise up here in the bump, that makes it a valid distance from the converter, so the heat is not going to be an issue, right? So, to do that, the first step is, it just says add that converter part to our assembly. So I got the assembly open here now. Remember this, well, no, it should work if it just says add component. I was going to say let me try before I say this. If I go to add component, yeah, it is the add component window. I don't know if you remember, we were having some issues before when you create a new component in the assembly, depending on your settings now in this version of NX, it would either create a component without you giving a chance to name it, or it would let you actually go to the File New window and pick exactly what you want to name it and what you wanted. And then there's another setting, I can't remember where it comes into play, but there's another setting that sometimes it goes to assemble instead of add component. So, but in this case, we're actually directly picking add component, so I really shouldn't even have brought it up now that I'm thinking of it. But we're doing an add component. I want to grab the converter, and if you had downloaded it from D2L, obviously you got it in a folder somewhere. So I have it in a folder right here from my Fall 24 class. Just opening it, or I'm adding it, and it does say, make sure you're, well, I think I say this. Well, it doesn't say it, but you want to make sure, it's in absolute position. Sometimes this default, let me see what the default is. Yeah, if you do the default for add component, and you pick a component, okay, it's not showing up yet because my default assembly location down here in the add component window is set to snap, which means don't just put it in its own absolute position. Pick some location where you want it to snap, okay? Well, we don't want to do that. The converter part was designed in the correct assembly position. So if we set this to absolute, now it really doesn't matter in this case, absolute work part and absolute display part, because they're both referencing that same CSIS location. So I think I got it on the actual display part, but whatever. So it showed up there. Oh, and also, why is that? I guess it does come up to this most of the time. It popped it right where I needed it. I could move this if I wanted to, but I'm not going to move it anywhere. So if you do get those handles to move it, ignore them. Just hit OK. It was a lot of talking just to say bring that part in. It shows up right in the right spot. So you can see that's what I was talking about. Where the top of that is, it's too close to the metal there. So we got to put a little bump here, right? The other thing I have you do, just to keep it a little simpler, is that converter. If I do go into the part and look at the part navigation, it is one single body, but it's a little more complicated. We don't need all that. geometry. I mean, it really wouldn't make much difference for what we're gonna do next, but I try to say, well, let's simplify this a little bit. All we really need is the surface stuff that really, the only one we really need is the one up in the top, this top, you know, where it's kind of flat along the top. Because the idea, I guess, with this one is, and I say I guess because the guy who originally built this project, he worked on floor plans, so he's kind of saying it's flat here, it's close right there, but as it starts to come down this little slant, we're not concerned with that area so much. It's just right where that peak is on that thing. So in other words, we don't need all this extra junk. Well, all right, then we'll do this. Oh, I'm sorry, it says hide all the cross member stuff, and in the floor pan, because that's what we're working on this time. We're only working on the floor pan. It says insert a feature group called converter clearance geometry. Basically, all the stuff that makes up that bump, we're going to put that somewhere in our part navigator. We don't want it at the end of the tree. We want it in its own feature group called converter clearance geometry, which should be right after the sill weld flange. So let's see. I got the main shape, I got main slabs, tunnel, and sill weld flange. Okay. Well, this is going to be kind of like we did. You know, the tunnel, we kind of organized it in its own stuff. The main slabs, we organized that in its own folder. And the weld flange on both sides, we organized that in its own folder. So this little bump's going to be in its own folder. And there's a little trick, because I even mentioned it in the instructions. I want a new feature group right after sill weld flange. And you could create it, you might put it in the wrong spot, you could drag it up there. A way to make it easier is to make that bold right there, the sill weld flange, make it the current feature. Okay, if you do that, and then you go to feature group, it's going to put it right after the current feature. So that's bold. The next one should go right after it, not in it, but after it. Remember that? Because current feature means something's going to go after it. Active means something's going to go in it if it's a feature group. So let's see. I'm going to say we're going to name it converter clearance geometry. Didn't do too bad on that one. And see, it pops it right in there, right after that one. That's now that's the current feature. So if I create anything, right now it's not going to go in that one, it's going to go right after it. But obviously we want stuff to go in it in a couple minutes, right? So then we go to the other part that I added here, make it the work part, right? So I see all this other stuff here. And actually I'm looking at that, and I didn't, in my floor pan, I didn't go to the end of the history, so it shows like that, but I'm not worried about that right now. So again, I was saying this before, to keep it kind of simple, all we need is really the top half of this area, this constant width area, but I have you pick both sides for some reason. I don't remember why I did that. But it says, use extract geometry, which if you go to the home tab, it's in the more button, extract geometry. And as a reminder, extract geometry is almost identical to creating a wave link. But extract geometry means you're picking something in the same file. Wavelinks means you're picking something in a different file, not the file that you're in. So this, I want to make copies of the little top and bottom surface in this same file. So that's why I'm using extract geometry. It says go to face, and because we want to pick, because I'm having you pick two faces, this one and that one, the one way to do it is as a face chain. If you do it as a single face, it will let me pick two faces. Actually, let me just show you this. I guess I don't tell you where to put it in the converter part. I guess we're just going to leave it right there. I don't have any feature groups in the converter part. So if I have it on, just an FYI, if you have it on single face, I can pick a face like that, and I can pick two at once. If I hit OK, it did pick them both and it extracted them both, but it made two separate features, okay? So the other method, the other option, extract geometry, if you set it to face chain, I mean, I know there's a lot of other ones in there. You set it to face chain, now here too, by default this goes to single face, but if I had it on tangent faces and I pick that, it's gonna pick the whole part, because they're all tangent. So I don't think I tell you in the instructions, but make sure this is on single face. It should be by default. That means I can only pick one at a time. But if I have it on face chain, I can pick one, and it did pick one. But I can also make a second pick, it's got two faces picked, and if I hit OK, the difference between just face and face chain is if you pick multiple faces under face chain, as long as they're all touching, it makes them one feature. Okay. When I did it as single face, I made two picks and made two features. Anyway, another thing, I spent a lot of time talking about that. It's just an option that's good to be aware of. Now, just to make sure it really worked, I can hide the converter, and there it is. Okay. So it says, now we're going to take that, but we really want to keep it simple. Okay. I don't really need all that body, but this guy, I only need those surfaces, and I am going to copy and paste them into my other file. But I don't know if you remember any exercises. We didn't do any in this class, I don't think. But when you do a copy and paste from one part to another, which is what we're going to do, it gets pretty complicated because this is an extracted face, which means it's parametric. It's got links to something else. So if I copy this here in its own file, and then I go to the floor pan and I paste it, the floor pan is going to say, well, it's an extracted face from another part, from another feature. But that feature's in a different part. So it's either going to want me to copy the whole thing, or it's going to make a link to that body here in the floor pan. I mean, in the cross converter. In other words, to make a long story short, I don't want that to have any history. I want it to just be done, because we're only going to borrow it to find out how far this is from the floor pan. So I can just get some dumb copies of it. So what I tell you to do is, it says, use menu, edit, feature, remove parameters. Okay. So I'm going to pick that, and then I can go to menu, edit, feature. I just said it, I forgot what it was. Feature, remove parameters. Okay. I already have it picked, so that means if you hit OK, it says it'll remove the parameters from the selected objects. So in other words, it's going to be done. You sure you want to do this? And I'll hit OK. And now that's not an extract anymore, it's just a dumb body. Okay. Just FYI, I know I went to the old menu for that because that's where I was used to going to get it. But I think, yeah, I put this in I turn this on in my home tab. Remember, if you go over here to the right, you can turn on the edit group. I think that's off by default. But in the edit group and inside the edit group, in the more gallery, you can turn on some other ones like remove parameters. Remember that whole thing? You just keep following these little arrows, and you can work your way down. You can work your way inside these menus and turn things on with little check marks. So in other words, I made that available right there. So I could have went right there to remove parameters instead of going the old way here. Okay. Anyway, now I got a non-parametric body. It's dumb. But just to keep it simple, I'm going to say, let's call it main converter faces. Those are the ones that we have to be concerned with. Just talking and typing at the same time. I'm usually not good at that. Then it says copy that. So right click, copy. Then I'm going to go to here and in a different part, the floor pan. Okay. It could be the inputs. I want to make sure I told you where to put it. So I did say, put it in the inputs group, make that active. And then just anywhere over here, when it's done resetting itself, just do a paste. Okay. And now because it's just dumb, there's not a lot of information in this window. If it came from somewhere else and it was looking for the parents, you'd be able to turn on copy resolving geometry, and it would ask, it'd ask you to line things up. It would be very much more complicated. But because it's just dumb, I just made another dumb body in main converter faces. Just to see where I'm at here, if I go make the last feature current. There it is. Okay. So now that's inside of this part. We only temporarily borrowed that. We're not linked to it at all. It's a dumb surface that we copied from it. So it actually says, we don't need that part anymore. So you can delete it. To take a part, I don't know if you remember, take a part out of an assembly, you actually just right click and delete it from the tree. That does not delete the part from whatever folder I have it in. That just takes it out of the assembly. Okay? So we deleted that. Now I'm gonna take a minute or two to talk about this. I'm actually gonna hide this for a second. What I have you do, basically we're gonna use that, well, let me say it like this. We're gonna build that wall, that little bump around this part. We're gonna start out with some planes that define the extreme edges of this thing. The two sides like this, and then the top, at least the extreme top of the part. Hard to line up, the very top. I wanna make a plane exactly across the top of that, and a couple exactly on the sides of that, right? Well, in older version of NX, I had you go to there was a tool under analysis, it was called Measure Extreme or Extremum, but they don't have it here anymore, okay? They do have, in the Measure tool, they have a tricky way to do that, but I was having a hard time writing it up and getting it to work right when I rewrote this exercise for NX 2212. I will show it to you though, I kind of figured it out. I could go back and change this again, but let me do it this way first, the way I tell you to do it. It says, I need to make a plane that's flush with the top of that part. So now I'm gonna hide this. Oops, I'm not in the floor plan, I gotta be in the floor plan. Hide this. Make a plane that's flush with that. I do tell you to do the measure, and I just basically say, because that surface, or that converter stuff is a little bit above the XY plane. So I have you measure between, make sure I tell you what the measure. The top converter facing the XY plane, yeah, that's what I thought. So it says go to object. I want to make sure this is set to single face. I picked the top face. Remember the new measure tool here, it gives you information if you just pick one thing. But if you make a second pick, like the XY plane, it's giving me angles and the minimum distance, okay? And just to make it visually easier, I can turn off angle. I don't need to see that. But the minimum distance, try to rotate it in an easy way. It's giving me the minimum distance, but I kept saying I wanted it across the top, flush with the top. Well, it's giving me the distance to the bottom edge, right here, see that? That's the bottom edge of that surface I picked. But remember, you can also say, what's the maximum distance between the XY plane and the top surface? The extreme of the top surface, the maximum distance, it says 207, okay? It just says, just note the value, cancel that. I wanna make a plane now. Let's go to Home tab, Datum Plane, add a distance from the XY plane, 207, okay? And just to put it near the part, technically you don't have to, because this plane is infinite, but you can drag it like this, drag it over here, whatever, however much work you want to put into doing that. Don't worry about it being exact. So there's the plane, right? So that's the way I had you do it, all right? I just want to show you something, just because it's handy to know this. I'm going to temporarily hide that. Okay, if you do the measure tool, go to analysis and measure, they kind of built in that extremum thing that I mentioned. Down here where you got different things you can display, when you pick stuff, you want to see distances, you want to see the length of curves, you want to see angles, you want to see face information, square millimeters, do you want to see volume, cubic millimeters, you want to see that information? And then there's one here that says extreme, but that one's off by default. So here's how I can come up, basically what I used to do is, give me a point at the extreme top of this surface, right? So, I turn on extreme, doesn't do anything yet. I'm gonna pick that surface, and again, I wanna make sure it's on single face. I'm gonna pick that surface. In my little hints down here, see how there's the hints? It says, well, if you pick another object, you can get measurements between that and the surface. But it says, if you wanna do extreme point, which is what I want, define directions, okay? So what I really wanna do is show me the furthest point upward, which is the Z direction, in that direction. On that surface, give me the highest points in the Z direction, the extreme in the Z direction. What you have to do though, this is why it's tricky, but once you do this a few times, it's good to know this. I want to pick a vector. Well, remember, by default, I'll pick an object. But if I set this to vector, I can say, go in the Z direction. Okay. and it is pointing upward. And if you can see on here, it's given me multiple points actually. It says in my hints, there are multiple extreme points. There's like 3. It's basically saying, well, which point do you want? Because the highest point in the Z direction, it's actually would be an infinite number of points. It'd be a straight line across there. It's just showing 3 of them, okay? But it's kind of telling you can narrow it down a little bit more. If you give it an additional direction, it'll reduce it. Now, technically, it doesn't matter. You know, I could use this point at the highest location or that point. They're both at the same height. But just to make it down to 1 point, if I pick, let's say that vector, it finally said, all right, you're saying on that green surface, give me the highest point in the Z direction, but also the furthest point in the X direction. So that's this guy right here. There's a little point, it says extreme point, okay? That's the one I want. That's what I'm looking for, so I can put a plane right there. Now, the only other thing is you gotta go down here to settings, and you gotta turn on, oh, why isn't it not let me pick create geometry? That's what I was having an issue with before. On my laptop, it lets me turn on create geometry. Why is it not doing it here? I don't know why. That's the issue I'm having right now, where I can't turn on create geometry. That's what I was having when I was writing up the document, so that's why I had us do it a different way. There's another, maybe associative, that doesn't make it. I don't know if there's a combination of the settings. But if you were able to turn on create geometry, it's pointing at an extreme point, and you'd hit OK, and there would be a little plus right there, a point that you can use to run a plane through. So now that I showed you all, there might be something in my preferences maybe I have turned off. I'm not going to waste time looking for it. I'll do it after I'm done and see if I find it, I'll let you know. But that's how you use extreme measurements now. It used to be a separate command called measure extremum, or extreme. Now it's in the measure tool, and you got to turn on the little button. Either way. So, all right, so the workaround to that was, we'll just, like I said, just do a measure and get the maximum distance and make a plane. So I did that. I was probably supposed to make that converted clearance geometry. I didn't put it in there. So I'm gonna make that active. But I didn't hit undo when I made my plane, did I? I think I still have it. Maybe I did hit undo. Is that it? Yeah, I put it in the wrong spot. So that should be in converter clearance geometry. Okay. And for some reason I moved that down there. I don't know why. That's why I think it's better if you can put a feature group right where you want it, right off the bat. That's a lot better, because if you try to move them around later, the tree starts moving on and it gets ugly. But I was able to do it. So I got converter clearance geometry. I made a plane. Right. All that was just to make the plane that's going to help us build that bump. Now I spent a lot of time talking about another tool just because it's good to know. Right? But that's the top of the converter. The clearance geometry, based on the engineering, says we got to be 32 mils away from there on that bump. So we're going to make another plane coming up at distance 30, what did I say, 32 mils right there. Okay. Now we're going to make planes that represent the extremes on this thing. So in a similar way, it says go to the measure command. We're trying to find the distance, the maximum distance from, because we're going to make planes that are offset from this guy, ZX, from there to that top surface. And I still have it on maximum distance, so it's going to the outside there. So that's 459, and you can make a mental note of that. It tells you in the instructions. It says measure that, but it is just 459 on this side. The minimum distance, if I look at the minimum, where you change it here, on that side is 351. So it says make a note of those two values, right? 459, 351. Okay, cancel that. Then you're going to make a plane, two planes. One plane, and again, you can do inferred. You can say, oh, I'm sorry, no, we're not doing it. We're doing at distance because we're using the number. I should have remembered that. So that one is going to be 351. And if you want to line it up better, turn it sideways. Drag it over there, drag it up a spend all day doing that, how they apply. There's one there, and it's right on the extreme edge of that, because we measured it. Now make another one from the ZX 459. Of course, same thing. Alright. Now I'm gonna take the copy of horizontal slab. How many times do we use this guy? That's up in the main shape, main slabs. Horizontal slab, I'm not gonna do the horizontal slab because that got trimmed, consumed, but there's the copy. And we're gonna build that, we're gonna build just a little bump shape. It's gonna have 3 walls going around it because it's gonna be open-ended on the back. So a wall coming this way, a wall going across the front, a wall coming back, and then a top surface, right? So to make the 2 side walls, we're gonna make intersections. And intersect between this guy and one of the planes, and apply it. And intersection between that guy and the other plane. So those intersections represent the extremes of where the sides of the converter are. Then we're gonna make law extensions to make the actual walls for the, again, it's coming up to make the walls on the side of the bump coming up. Surface, law extension. It's gonna be the vector type. Vector type meaning we gotta pick a direction using a line or vector or a plane. So the curve, it doesn't really matter which one I pick first, I can do that one. The vector, reference vector is gonna be the Z. So that means we're measuring the angle with respect to the Z. The angle is 30. And that's the thing about this. When in my instructions I tell you to use lengths and angles and extension side lengths. Make sure you're looking at the right one. You know, the first one is the actual main length. The second one is the angle. Third one, if you're on asymmetric, it's extension side length, it's the other length. So I do say 75 for the length, okay? And I like to hit enter. In NX you can hit enter and it doesn't close the window. In CATIA it would close the window. The angle's 30, I'll hit enter, and then the bottom one is 25, which already looks right. And most of it's coming up, we overbuild when we're doing surfacing. So it is overbuilt a little bit downward, but mostly upward. Okay, that looks right. So I'm gonna hit apply. And make another one on the other side tilted in the opposite way. So we'll do this curve. Reference vector will again be the Z. Same numbers, in this one the arrow's going the correct way. If it wasn't, remember you can reverse things. Okay, that one I'll hit okay. So I got the 2 sides of that bump. Right, now we're gonna make the top of the bump, and it says, I'm sorry. We're gonna make a log, no, we are gonna make a log extension. Oh, I forgot something. Forgot a step. I was reading ahead of my instructions, I missed one step. Because I scrolled down and I thought I was done with that. We're gonna get that plane that we made right here, the 32mm plane. You know, I think I'm gonna hide those 2 original intersections, because they're visually in the way. But I got that plane, that's a representative. I'll even hide that plane, because that one's the lower one. And you know what, well, I'm gonna hide those. So I still have that plane. That's the one I brought up above, the 32mm up above the converter. So we're gonna do an intersection curve between that plane and either one of those faces should work. Okay. Then we're gonna make a law extension with that. And the Z-axis will be the vector, and we're going 90 degrees to the Z-axis. So surface, law extension, that curve, reference is the Z. Right? And then if we make it 90, that means it's gonna be perpendicular to the Z. And just to make sure the numbers are right, the lengths, it's 130 on one side and 40 on the other. And because I'm starting on the right side, I need the longer side to go left. Right now it's not. My longer side's going to the right, but again, you can just flip arrows. Okay. Fixes it. So I got the law extension there, that's the top. So I actually have almost all the walls to make the bump. I got 2 side walls and a top wall, but I need a front wall, because the bump doesn't go all the way through the floor pan. It's open at the back, but it stops over here somewhere. Right? So this one, again, because of our experience in creating, I'm doing all these things in the wrong set again. I forgot to activate Those are the clearance geometry. I put them in there, and then of course I gotta move it back up. Right? And this time I'm gonna activate it, which I should have done way back when. But anyway, I'm gonna make a plane, and our experience tells us, well, the front of that bump, maybe we measured the converter or whatever, it's gotta be 1880 from here. So I'll make a plane at distance from YZ, 1880. Okay, right? Then I'm gonna use that to make a guide for my last law extension. I'm gonna intersect that plane with our top, where's my top law extension? Where's the law extension I just made? Sorry. Oh, I didn't grab that. I didn't grab those two. Sorry about that. Grab these two. Put them up where they belong in here. Of course, it's gonna move it back down. Come on, why are you not behaving? There. So I have everything I need. Can I continue now? Yes. So I'm gonna do a curve intersection. Make that active again. I almost forgot. Intersection curve, that plane. No. That plane. And my law extension right there. So it took me 10 minutes to make one little curve. So I got an intersection curve. We're gonna make our last law extension. Okay. Says length of 60, angle of 40, opposite side 60 also. I could have done them symmetric in this case, but since I got it set to asymmetric, I'm just typing 60 in both. So that little curve I just made, reference vector is the Z. Okay. 60 and 40, so the angle's 40. Two lengths are 60. Not tilting the right way, because the bump is I can tell, this is the back of the floor pan. The bump comes up this way, and then the front wall is gonna tilt, like so.
Your angle is 90/40.
9,040, thank you. It looked right though, didn't it? I guess that would be right, 90 times whatever, 100, it still was 90 and 40, so anyway, I gotta reverse that angle, not that one, that one. Thanks for catching that. Although it probably would've worked even if I left it like that. But I would've looked at it later. I said, what? 9,040. So then we finish the bump. It says 15 mil radius. So I'll start on one side like that side. I'll add it to the front because the two sides don't hit each other just yet. Oh, here, I'm gonna move that away. 15 mils. I can already see it looks right. I'll just hit apply. And then I'll add that thing to the other side. Oops, didn't do it right. I didn't pick the right field in the window. Didn't pick the right piece that time. Okay, that. Put the arrow, go to the next field, which I forgot to do. That guy. Flip that. Where we get 15. No, it's not. It's at 5 because it reset. 15. Look the other side, yeah, it does. Okay. All right. And then to finish the bump, we had the top, another 15 mil radius, face plate. And that little top surface I made. was our bump. Right, and you can kind of see, and it's not added to the rest of the part yet, but it's kind of wrapping up and over and coming back down the other side from the converter, right? Now, I use this surface, but I'm not gonna need it anymore, and I'll hide some other stuff here. This is probably the trickiest part, but not really tricky, it's just, you gotta think about it, it's very logical, okay? We're adding this bump as if, you know, I should say, we're adding it after I had the part already done. I'm gonna take the last feature card, and I'll show our whole part. Actually, I have it in my final part. Things got rearranged here. Put this after that. What's main shape? Perimeter trim final. Okay, I'm good. I think I'm good. So the very last thing I have in here is the trim sheet, right? That was our floor pan defined. But as I started to say, before I got confused looking at my tree, I want to add that. I mean, I could do a one more faceplate and add it, right, to the bottom of the floor pan. But that's not matching the way I have this thing organized. I had the main shape, which consists of the main slabs, like I talked about before, and then the tunnel, and the sill weld flange, okay? I had them in their own little subgroups, right? And now I got the converter clearance geometry. After we made all those separate things, then we did all these combinations of things, where I added the main slabs to the tunnel. And then I added the sill weld flange stuff to the rest of the part. And then we did the trim. Now I could decide, actually I want to add this to the part before I even had the tunnel. I could do that. But we just decided in the exercise, just add it as if it was the last thing we did before we trimmed the part. So when we trimmed the part, that was that guy, floor pan defined. So what I really want to find out is, and we made this part, so we kind of know this, if you remember. We had the main shape, and then we made that perimeter trim thing, that funny looking thing that had little strips on the side. And we trimmed the main shape with that. So that made this thing called floor pan defined. So I already know the last thing we had, we called it main shape defined, pretty sure we did. Or I'm sorry, no, we called it final form before trim. That was the overall part before we trimmed it. So having it named, that's already good enough. I don't have to do any more searching and trying to figure out where to put it. I want it to be after that, because again, final form before trim, if I go back in time, I know I'm taking the time explaining this. That's when the part looked like this. It wasn't yet trimmed. So at this point, I want to add that last faceplate. Now that's gonna put one after this one in the Navigator, but that's okay, I'm gonna rename it a little bit. But let's say we didn't have it named very well, and maybe it wasn't our part, and I'm not sure that, you know, is that the last thing that we did before the trim? So I just introduced, I could have done this in an earlier step, but I introduced something here where you take, well, I should call that, sorry, I forgot to rename that guy is called exhaust clearance wall. I'm showing you a tool that lets you investigate the history in a neat way, okay? You know, it's like parents and children kind of thing. I mean, again, this is, I don't go in this deep in the instructions, but you know, whenever you pick something in the Navigator, it does show you parents and children. Parents are usually red or magenta like that, okay? Now, the floor pan defined, the trim sheet, the final part, it is showing parents way up here. And if I look way up there, it says, well, there's a horizontal slab, and it's weird because it doesn't show me any more up there. Sometimes it's a little bit off. I don't know why it doesn't show me everything it should show me. Because in perimeter trim, it's saying that, well, yeah, all this stuff, basically the last thing on here, perimeter trim defined, that was that funny looking thing. Yeah, that was a direct parent of the floor pan defined. But what was the positive material that was being trimmed, right? And I already said, yeah, if you know this, it's that guy, final form before trim. But what if you don't know it? Okay, so I'm just showing you this tool. there's a tool called Browse. It's like CATIA's Parents and Children. If you right click on a feature like this trim sheet, bottom of the tree, it's right here, it's called Browse. Brings up a window. Okay, see, it's like a little graph. Okay, now there's different ways you can set this. What I tell you is, make sure you're not showing feature groups, and make sure this is set to timestamp on the bottom. So it should look like this. I picked the trim sheet and I basically said, let me browse it. What are its direct parents, what are its direct children? Well, there's nothing to the right, so there's no children. Children will be on the right, parents will be on the left. But it tells you what was exactly before that. What came together to make this trim sheet? What are its direct parents? One of them is the perimeter trim defined. One of them is the final form for trim. So it's just a more official way of finding where I want to put this next blend. I got to make an extra blend that I should have made earlier, but I didn't know about it until now. So I really wanted to go right at that point. Okay, so it'll be the last thing I do before this trim sheet happens. So, and then in this case, I'll make a mental note. It's face blend 107, final form before trim. I think I tell you to do the same thing. Yeah, it just says, we determine that it's before the final form before trim, or right after it, I should say. So that means I'm going to go here, and if I want to put something right after it, how do you do that? You make it the current feature. That's the current feature now. It's bold. That means whatever I create next will go right after it. And it's simple what I'm going to do. I'm just going to make an 8mm radius blend between, and now that I'm back in time, see, I'm in an earlier time before the trim happened. So I'm just going to make a blend between those two at that point in the history. So the history knows that right after this, I'm going to say this statement. It knows right after this I did the trim down here, the trim sheet. Now the way you did the trim sheet does actually matter for this to work right. In fact, you know what? Before I do that, sorry, I want to do a little explanation here. If I go to the trim sheet, for what I wanted to trim, it does say select sheet body. Well, actually it doesn't matter as much as what I'm saying now. It says sheet body, and we pick that. But that thing called the sheet body, it is the result of a bunch of features and a bunch of operations, right? So whatever that, the last thing I did in that case was a face blend. That face blend finished that sheet body all as one thing. So when I'm trimming it, I'm trimming that sheet body. But it's smart enough to know, if I jump ahead where I went back from, it's smart enough to know if I do a face blend between this and that, okay, make sure you pick this first and then that, okay? That's kind of important. So if I do my face blend, and the reason I'm saying this is, as you're adding things, as I built up to this, we made trim and extend, we did edge blends, we did face blends. Every time you add something new to your overall accumulated part, it's making a new sheet body, right? But the order you pick things, which I didn't really spend too much time on, but I did kind of say, when you're making a face blend, pick the overall accumulated part first as face 1, and then pick the new thing as face 2. I'm going to do that here too. My overall accumulated part is this big thing. And the reason I'm saying that is because the trim sheet that's happening down below, it thinks it's this big thing that's being trimmed. If I pick this first right now, then my trim at the bottom of the tree, it's going to say, well, this sheet body, it may or may not work. It might have an issue with that, saying, well, that sheet body wasn't what we were trimming before. I know that might not make a lot of sense to you, but it's very logical. So if you remember anything from my little demo here, when you're making things like face blends or anything that incorporates stuff together, always pick the overall accumulated geometry first. And I know I'm blending this to this, so it's going to come up. We're making a little blend right in here, coming upward. Face 2 will be that. Make sure it's on body faces too. Okay. And it's 8 mils, did I say? Yeah, 8 mils. All right. I can preview it. Yeah, that looks good. So I'm adding that last bump to the overall part before it got trimmed. I'm going to hit OK. And I'll come back to that in a second. I just added a new thing in the history. Let's see if it worked, if I make the last feature current. And I didn't get any errors. Looks right. I see the trim shape, right? It is trimmed. I see the notches and everything. It's trimmed to the exact size. And I see that bump in there, okay? And if I go to the floor pan define and I go to browse, now it says, right before the trim sheet, you had the trimming piece, but you also had something that you just made, Faceblend 108. That's what I just made. So it did pick it up. Now, right before this guy is final form before trim. So doing it the way I did, I mean, just by default, in NX, when you go back in time, make something current feature, and you add another feature right after it, it's inserting itself into the history. So just 2 minutes ago, this wasn't here. This guy was connected to that guy. But I went back in time to this, added this one, and it automatically inserts itself. I know I repeated that, but that's something you need to be aware of in NX. We haven't really dealt with that very much, but that's good to know. That's how you put things in after the fact. Wherever you want it to be inserted in the history, make the thing right before it current. Then insert the thing that should have been there all along, and it inserts it before whatever happens next. Everything I'm saying, in my head it's logical. I don't know if you're grasping it, but it's very logical. Of course, the naming isn't very good anymore, but I'm not worried about that. What we're gonna do is, and it tells you in instructions, just for history's sake, you don't really have to do this. You can just delete that name, but I tell you, go to the rename field. I think the instructor that did it before called it this. Old final form. And then this one is new final form before trim. Technically, I could have just taken the name off of that one and just called this one final form before trim. But just so we can look at it later and say, yeah, remember when we inserted that after we already had it done? Trimming. I'll leave it with a misspelling, right? Basically, that's it. So creating the bump wasn't that big of a deal. It was just some walls, law extensions, intersections, law extensions, and fillets, right? Face blends. But the biggest thing about that exercise is how do you insert it after the fact, right? And again, just in case anybody here also is in CATIA classes, in CATIA, you have to tell it, if you're gonna do something after the fact like that, you have to tell it with a separate setting, with a separate switch, I want to insert this in the middle of the history. If you don't tell it that, it's not gonna insert it between things, it's gonna add it to the history. We don't want to add it to the history, we want to put it at the right time before certain things happen and after certain things happen. So in NX, it automatically inserts itself after whatever the current feature is. Okay. Does that make a little bit of sense? It's one of those things, very logical, but you need to be aware of that if you start working on NX model. Okay? All right. There's gonna be I think, what is this, 4A? So there's gonna be a 4B, so you don't have to turn this one in just yet, because, I'll say this right now, well, if you're doing this like me, I did all that work, I'm gonna make the assembly active and save this. That saves the assembly and the floor pan and anything else I might have done in the other ones. But if I show these guys, here's why we're gonna have another exercise next week related to this. Now, I have a bump there, but my cross member is crashing right through it. Okay, same as that one. So we're gonna have to do something about that, okay? But that's next week. Okay, I'm done.